middle of the afternoon, so we need to wake everyone up.
Let's do our
So
best.
we need to keep the conversation lively and meaningful. So, okay, just quickly getting into the whole deep tech piece. Thoughts on capitalization, thoughts on what will it take to really have the next, giants in deep tech coming out?
So deep tech is a slightly different beast. I mean, if we look back at the history of venture capital, history of startup community, it actually started with a lot of deep tech, but over a period of time, shallow tech has come about, which is people trying to solve the simpler problems. Now that many of those simpler problems have been solved, people are beginning to focus back on technologies which require significant amount of R&D to happen, significant amount of product development to happen. And these products will have a relatively longer gestation period, longer cycle. It takes a while for a technology to mature from a technology readiness level 1 to technology readiness level 5. I mean, TRL is the framework which is very often used for measuring how ready a technology is to hit the market. I think within this segment, there is a much different ecosystem which has a role to play. Universities, for example, have a very critical role to play in helping develop these technologies. Very often these technologies may not necessarily have a ready market. I mean, as we've seen elsewhere in the world, the government has a very active role to play in actually adopting these technologies, being the first customers for these technologies, and the entire ecosystem actually needs to help them. I mean, the corporates need to come and chip in, help adoption of these technologies. Very rarely would these technologies be consumer focused. Maybe it will take a little while for consumers to accept these technologies, but B2B, B2G, the entire ecosystem needs to actually very actively facilitate the adoption of these technologies. So very different from what the consumer tech landscape in the country or across the world has been. This will require a slightly different approach. From an investor standpoint, we'll need to be a lot more patient versus what we've been with consumer tech companies. These will take maybe 6 to 8 to 10 years for these technologies to mature. And I'll give you a very simple example of one of the companies that we'd invested long back. I mean, this is a company called IdeaForge, which recently had an IPO in India. But it took them almost 14 years to get to a point where they became IPOable. They were primarily serving the defense sector, and therefore it took a while for the contracts to come about. But once these technologies are proven, once they've gotten to a point where the product market fit has been established, you end up creating significant differentiations, moats, since we were talking about it, enormous amount of intellectual property that gets developed, which becomes your moat. And there's no better moat to develop versus a intellectual property which is safeguarded behind a patent. So that's the landscape that we are going to be operating in within the.
So, are there specific areas within deep tech where you think that there's natural sort of momentum building up, both in India and maybe in this region, that you'd like to comment on?
See, I mean, it's fantastic to see the excitement around AI that's happening here, but also in India. I feel that within India, and again, the government of India, you did refer to it, has very recently launched what is called the Research Development and Innovation Fund, which is a phenomenal commitment that the government of India is making, almost close to around $2.5 billion commitment on an annual basis that's going to go into primarily startups creating deep tech innovations. A big
And I
chunk.
think what is interesting about that is that the department which has been, commissioned, which is commissioning this fund of funds, is actually spending time with all the stakeholders to understand the landscape, areas of focus, which is quite collaborative and quite interesting.
I mean, it's pretty much been industry designed, and kudos to the government for having done that. But I mean, you look at it from a semiconductor standpoint, you look at space tech, you look at advanced materials, you name it, robotics. The government is focusing on many of these sectors, and rightly so, because these are the sectors where the market failures are happening. I mean, as I was mentioning earlier, the gestation periods tend to be much longer. So if the government puts in capital where the markets are failing and provides a risk cushion to private investors like us, entrepreneurs. It allows them to leapfrog the proverbial valley of death and get to a point where these become viable in the market. And government definitely has a critical role to play there.
And I think it'll also make these startups much more acceptable to their customers, which often is the government, like you mentioned. I think, so the government, in a sense, becomes an enabler both from a risk capital, one end is that, and as a customer at the other end, And I think that also opens up international markets, wherever India sort of has good trade relationships. So, but I'll come back to my earlier question. Is there any specific, 2, 3 areas where you really think should be India's focus at the moment?
So I definitely feel that India has already taken a little bit of or made a little bit of a head start in, and I don't want to talk about AI. I mean, everyone has talked about AI sufficiently here. I want to talk, for example, about space tech. India has really come of age, some fascinating companies that have come out of, or have been coming out of India. And what we see now, Archana, is clusters emerging.
Yeah.
A very interesting space cluster is emerging around Ahmedabad because there's ISRO there. So fascinating number of companies that are coming just around space, whether it is on the downstream side, whether it is on the upstream side. Both sides the innovation is happening. The second area is biotech. And I mean, what's happening today is data, biology, technology, everything is converging, which means the time and effort that is going into developing new products has been crunched.
Yeah.
So phenomenal amount, and I mean, kudos to the government of India again, because biotech is an area where the government has been investing for the last almost 15 odd years with BIRAC and other interventions. Yeah. So that's one interesting segment which is emerging.
And where are those clusters? For the sake of the audience,
yeah, so the biotech cluster is actually in Bangalore significantly. There's an institution called CCAMP, which is fast emerging as a biotech cluster enabler. But many of these institutions, I should say, where these technologies or these ventures are now coming out of are actually public institutions.
Yes.
While a cluster approach is one way to slice and dice this problem, an equally interesting approach is we look at the top research labs in the country, whether it is the Council of Scientific Industrial Research, whether it is the IIT system, whether it is IISc system, the ISER system, the Department of Biotech system. All of a sudden,
STPI.
All of a sudden, the research labs that we used to think are meant only for some academics.
We never knew what they were doing.
Yeah, we never knew what they were up to, are beginning to produce some phenomenal outcomes.
Yeah.
And these are outcomes that we as a country are beginning to feel extremely proud of. And I mean, the third cluster, which is automatically emerging, is actually in IIT Madras.
Yes.
Where the research park, I wouldn't necessarily slice or dice it sectorally. But even in an area like, a boring area, to make it controversial, a boring area like non-destructive testing laboratory in IIT Madras has now produced 8 companies that have been venture funded. So, enormous amount of innovation is happening in corners which we never knew existed. But those corners are beginning to produce some fantastic outcomes.
So, it's in diligence right now, but we are likely to invest in an eVTOL company, which is headquartered out of Jaipur. Can you imagine, of all places, and incredible work this founder has done. So, I mean, and it's a vertical, I'm like, wow, and with a pretty decent payload capacity. So, I think to the point that you're making, that these various clusters have, of course, given birth to a whole ecosystem which we almost didn't know was happening.
Yeah.
So we are on the last few seconds. So apart from these 2-3 areas that you pointed out, anything else that is not so evident as space tech and biotech and all is?
Yeah, I mean, I don't want to give a sector as such, but what I'm going to say is, and I made this point
Semiconductor is also pretty...
Semiconductor is picking up. The interesting thing that is happening, which I referred to in my conversation yesterday with some of us, is India is seeing that inflection point that India saw around liberalization, or India saw around Y2K, where all of a sudden Indian services company came to the limelight. this is the moment when Indian product companies are going to come to the limelight. I mean, we've seen examples of fantastic AI companies here, but I mean, you look at Observe, you look at Unifor, you look at Niramai, Indian AI companies which are beginning to make waves globally. Sarvam, and that's going to continue to happen in the times to come because of the enabling ecosystem that has finally come together. Capital on one side, these research labs have existed, chemicals, materials, green chemicals, so much happening.
Yeah, yeah. So I think if I would just quickly summarize for everybody in the audience that if you're looking for deep tech in India, you can look at it from a cluster perspective, sectoral perspective, and of course there are some hidden gems which I think need discovery and a little bit more of legwork and hard work. Any closing sort of summation points that you'd like to?
Yeah, I mean, the only thing I would say is there has never been a better time to be an entrepreneur in India. There has never been a better time to be an investor in India. You have to be patient. It will take a little while, but what people used to call an elephant is moving at a really fast pace today. And if you don't keep pace with it, you're going to miss out on a big opportunity. So requesting everyone here to actually participate in the Indian deep tech wave that's happening around us.
Everyone's welcome to India, right?
Yeah.
So thank you so much, Kunal. I think it was really a pleasure talking to you, and you've got a lot of wealth and breadth of experience in the investing space. And thank you, everyone. Thank you for listening to us.